Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be back. I'm not sure that I know there's a bit of a lag, so I'm just going to kind of work to set some things up here and get us all ready. Uh, and at 6 o'clock, we will begin. Um, and it is 6 o'clock, so we're going to begin. So, for those of you who were here last week, well, not here in my office, but were um, listening and viewing last week, we are going to do a little bit of a review. So, welcome back. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, welcome. Um, Last week was interesting. It was my I've been Zooming, as I said in our session last week. I have been Zooming for classes and for work and for my teaching and things like that, and for meetings and stuff, as I'm sure many of you are. But I never did do what I'm calling the Zoom YouTube live stream thing. So last week was my first time, and it was definitely it was definitely an experience. And I just want to sort of shout out to Faith over at the Writing Institute, who is working really hard and is on the receiving end of a lot of kooky texts and emails. And she was a big help in all this. So thanks to Faith. Hopefully we're up and running. And I'm actually hoping tonight I'm able to use the chat. So in fact, what I'll do is just start that and see if anybody is on watching at this point. You're welcome to respond. And then at some point later, for people who are watching, we can even do a little bit of back and forth chat. I may ask some questions about things having to do with senses, and you can respond in the chat. So again, welcome back. Welcome. This is Come to Your Senses and Find the Story. I'm going to do just a little review, a little recap of stuff that I had said last week. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do just want to give people a sense of what brought me to this topic and what brought me to wanting to, uh, just have a chat with whoever's out there wanting to get some ideas generated, maybe even get some words on the page, get some writing done, and do that all through connecting with your senses, with our senses. So, quick little recap. I came to this topic because I was a Writing Institute student many years ago, back in 2005, and so actually it's kind of cool because I was a student in the classes that I teach now there at the Writing Institute. I also teach at Montclair State, and I teach creative nonfiction there. But but at the Writing Institute, which is primarily people coming back into the classroom, people of all ages coming back into the classroom to sort of reacquaint themselves with the page. And so I was a student in 2005, and what essentially happened was I received a writing prompt in a classroom, and in a memoir personal essay classroom, as I said, similar to what I teach now. And the prompt was write your earliest memory, and one thing led to another, and I basically you know uh, found myself back at a time, and found myself hearing music, essentially. So hearing a song from when I was a little girl, and that just took me right back into a place. And then, of course, this at that point, it was as if it was as if sort of a gate had opened, and my senses really sort of came alive in some ways. So I just kept writing and writing and writing from there, and that prompt led me to it eventually became my manuscript. And so, yeah, it can happen that way. It took a long time, but it certainly can happen that way. So that's what got me thinking. And then, of course, I think I would couple that too with this notion that the work that I've done, and the work that I've done with students has also taught me how writing from the senses can be a really great place to get some rich material out there onto the page, and to begin to kind of tap into recollections, memories, and ideas that have a lot of texture and a lot of energy and what I like to call a lot of heat. And I don't mean that literally. Um, so that's kind of the backstory, or that's kind of where it all began. And I'm always interested in hearing about people's writing processes and how they use the senses to get uh, to get to get words and stories uh, out of their hearts, out of their minds, out of their spirits, and onto a blank page. I do just want to mention something. I was doing some reading since last week on this topic because I always like to sort of see what's currently being written about it, or what people are saying about it, and how I can also learn from the ideas that others are generating, um, writers and thinkers and people that I just come in contact with every day. And one of the things that I recently read was this notion of trying to use our senses to to remember things, but to also sort of find the emotional content of the senses. And the person who I was reading an article about it. I think the writer's name is Laura Deutsch. I think she was the one that had, or at least when I read it, had used that phrase, the emotional content, and that kind of really struck me and kind of stuck with me. So I'm just sort of tossing that out there. Courtesy of some reading that I did, Laura Deutsch's, um, uh, um, her phrase, emotional content, and just for us to think about that. So as we continue on in the next half hour or so, I'd like you to think about um, the the memories that you have and how you think about things that you have touched, touched, saw, tasted, smelled, and listened to, and where might the emotional content be coming from in recollecting those stories within you. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, hopefully it will. And also, if it doesn't by the end of the session, or by the end of the stream, that's okay too, because I have found that a lot of times things that haven't made perfect sense are oftentimes things that I roll back to try to tease out, not necessarily sensibility, but why there's some confusion, or why something may be not gelling or connecting. And in fact, if I go to the page with that in mind, that can actually be that can be a valuable experience, because now I'm sort of playing with ideas on a page and trying to figure out what it is I'm actually um, thinking. So we talked about this. I'm not going to get into it, but we talked about this in one of my last classes at Sarah Lawrence. I was teaching um, The Tiny and the Ordinary, which is a class that really allows us to think also about the senses, but a lot about tiny, ordinary details in our lives, past, present, and even to some degree future, I guess. And we were saying that many of us believe in this idea of going to the page to figure out what it is, in fact, we think, what it is, in fact, we're trying to say. That going to the page and writing is a way of organizing our thoughts. All right, so we have emotional content. That's what I'd like us to be thinking about today or tonight. If you're on the East Coast, it's just the early part of the night. And I also, so keep that in mind, this idea of what has emotional content and in relation to your senses. I do want to say just quickly too that for those of you who were with us last week, I did talk about the Joe Brainard book, and I read a little bit from this. And I don't know, again, for those of you who are joining for the first time, for those who were with us last week, and maybe I rolled through this quickly, but this was the book that I read from. This is a memoir. And the interesting thing about this memoir, as I said last week, is that every line in the memoir begins with the phrase, "I remember." I use this book all the time. it's probably my second copy. And it was written, let's see, it was written, I know it was in the 70s. It was written in 1975. So that was the Brainard book that we looked at, or we talked about a little bit last week. And I also did show and tell last week too, which I'm going to do a little bit of tonight, but not just yet. So let me start. Not start. I mean, obviously, I started a few 10 minutes ago now, but let's move into thinking about which way I want to go. Oh, I know. I was thinking about seasons, and at least again on the East Coast, where the seasons can be very, very sort of relevant and also sometimes extreme. Although this year, I was actually saying to someone recently that this year we didn't have a really crazy, at least in my mind, we didn't have a crazy bad winter. But I would like us to think about how the seasons also could be a vehicle for igniting our senses. So certainly the sense of smell, I mean, I know myself, the minute I start to, see the hyacinth, but most of all, be able to smell a hyacinth, I'm automatically, I mean, I actually do think about how we and my family growing up celebrated the Easter holidays, and just certain things around that time period. So it kind of takes me back. Lilacs actually also do take me back to a time as well. And so seasons, and of course, you could roll through all of them. I actually did a workshop with high schoolers a few years ago. And I remember the week before I was starting the workshop, I was in the drugstore. This was completely like, I had no intention of finding a writing prompt or finding any content for my class in that particular moment. I was in the drugstore, and there was a sign by the deodorant and antiperspirant section, and it says, what does freedom smell like? I think that's what it was. And it was like a specific brand, and there was a specific scent, and I was just struck by that. So I, of course, I think I actually bought the product and used it the following week in that class. And we actually had this really cool, lesson and class discussion around using that question, actually, what does freedom smell like? So that's kind of an interesting thing too, to combine, to even just take a sense and couch it in a question like that, as a way to kind of have to sort of form an answer. So that was something I wanted to mention. This idea of, as I said, this idea of oh, because I know why I was thinking this, because a lot of people, I had the product there, and it was a very, it just happened to be a very, it had like a coconut scent to it. And so a lot of people were saying it was like the summer. And for them, it reminded them of the summertime, and that kind of took them to certain places. And so that's the kind of thing too. And I think last week I talked about, when I was doing my show and tell thing, I did talk about scents, and aromas and smells. And I showed, I believe it was I believe I showed the package of Windsong, which was my mother's one of her favorite perfumes, and it sort of takes me right back. So, okay, emotional content, seasons. So that's another way to think about getting sensual details, having them kind of at play for yourself, and also I want to just mention too, last night I read a really great article that was in a literary journal, and I'm going to forget the name right now. I'll have to come back to it for next week, but it was by it's by a writer who writes a lot about music and about how music has kind of influenced his life. And he was talking about, or what I was reading in the piece, he was writing about and talking about this idea of like touching the 45s, like stacks of 45s in a record store, and what that felt like. And it made me think a lot again about music too. So there you have like the sense of touch, but you also have the listening, and just how music has been or can be such a trigger for writing, such a trigger for taking us back to our memories, to certain points and times in our lives. So I'm asking you to sort of think about that too. Music and its place in your life, and what happens when you turn on certain songs versus other songs. And again, if you're sort of tuning in as a writer who's been writing a long time, this applies to you. If you're tuning in because you're just kind of curious, and you haven't maybe written in a while, or maybe you haven't written ever, I would just suggest one way to get yourself going is to take your phone, or if you have a record player in your home. I mean, go wherever you need to go to get to music that matters for you, and play a song and just sit listening to that song with a blank piece of paper or with your laptop. And I think what's most important in this, to sort of round out the activity or the exercise, is to try to remind yourself to just listen to the song and write what you are feeling, and or write the scene that's in your head, as opposed to necessarily writing about it. And I'm going to talk about that briefly at the end, because I have a couple of books that I wanted to share with you tonight, or just excerpts from those books, of people that have been helpful to me, writers and guides, so to speak, or just books that have been really helpful to me in my own writing process. So that's another exercise, the music and writing exercise. Okay, let's move on to a couple of things. So basically, we have a question, I think. Is that based on the recognition that emotions are embodied and felt as sensations? Oh, I like that. You know what? I can only answer that as a card-carrying member of the human race, not necessarily as a scientist. But I would just say I do think that emotions are. I do think that emotions can be felt as sensations. Yes. Yes. So I'm going to say yes, I do. I'm just chatting here as in responding. I'm also just going to do it because we didn't do it last week, because I was all worried that I wasn't able to find the chat, because I was on the other screen actually last week. But yes, I do think that. I believe that actually I can only speak for myself, experience. I believe that I experience emotional content through sensual experiences. Okay, so that's one little chat exchange. All right. I'm going to take us into one thing I did want to say, just from just using the sense of sight. I'm not sure if people who were with us last week, I'm not even sure, because again, as I said to you, I wasn't looking at this screen last week. I was actually looking at a different one, so I wasn't sure how many people were tuning in or not. But last week, my bookshelves looked a little bit different. So I just wanted to say that my bookshelves, from a visual perspective, from the sense of sight, are organized in a different way. First of all, they're just much more organized and not as tippy. The bookshelf behind me used to sort of be tipping over, and the stacks were going vertically. But I now have, thanks to one of my daughters, I have a bookshelf or a few of my bookshelves now look like all the books are organized by color, and it's actually really cool, and I'm liking it a lot. So So that's just a note in terms of, and also I think it makes it made me think a little bit. And I talk about color a lot in my class. Actually, sometimes we even after we listen to a piece of writing, if a student is reading a piece of writing in workshop, I'll ask the students to just say what color you think that piece was, or what color do you think that that piece of flash nonfiction was, or what color is that poem? And that's always a cool way to get people talking about color and about and then oftentimes it'll just launch into even using the other senses. So there's another suggestion even for when you're reading different kinds of writing, no matter what the genre is, a question to ask yourself. Just another suggestion for getting conversation generated about literature. All right, so that's something I wanted to mention, my rainbow bookshelves. I also want to, I think what we'll do is, I guess one thing, I'm gonna actually do my show and tell, and then I'm going to read a little bit. But before I read, maybe what I'll do is see if people want to offer in the chat section, if you are watching, if anybody does want to offer. Um, Obviously, I'm not going to be able to see you, but maybe you can offer an object similar to what I've been doing last week and this week that sort of that ignites the senses and that you believe has some emotional content for you. So I'm going to start again. I don't have as much as I had last week, but I am going to start with a couple of things. And I didn't even do it in a particularly organized way. So as it turns out, I have mostly smell and really mostly smell and touch actually this week. So next week I'll have to do more sight and sound. But for this week, I wanted to share that can't believe I have this in my house, but I have, I have two things. I have difficulty throwing things out, and I have really amazing nieces and nephews who, when they come visit or when I go visit them, they know, and hopefully they know, that I love to play with Play-Doh. Because I do love to touch it, but that's not the primary reason. Is because I love the way it smells, and it does take me right back. And what's interesting, speaking of emotional content, is Play-Doh actually does bring me back to my childhood, but I guess this is how it happens in life. Now I'm finding it brings me back more to my children's childhoods. So there, I guess you could say that I have there's two possibilities, and not just two, but there's two times in my life that I am kind of catapulted to when I smell Play-Doh. And so in terms of material, the possibilities are endless, to use a cliche that I probably shouldn't use, but it is 6:23 on a Tuesday, so I'm going to give myself a free pass on that one. Next one up, I have, as I said, as I'm doing this, I want you to think about an object or something that, is similar to what I'm doing right now, and that you think that you can, even just toss into the chat if you want, and just, if an object or something that represents one of the senses that maybe you think you do have a story in you to tell about that. So the next one is calamine lotion. Actually, this is Caladril, but same difference. And the minute I smell this, I am totally taken back to my childhood, because I used to get very bad poison ivy, very bad. I still get it, but not as bad as when I was a kid. And I mean, I realize this is not, I'm sure this is something that would resonate for a lot of people, because poison ivy is not an uncommon thing to have a reaction to. But the minute I smell this, and of course, obviously, when you put it on, it creates such a unique sort of blotchiness on the skin that that's a whole other thing, right? A whole other thing that can be the start of stories, be the start of a story. But so it's the smell of calamine lotion. I think it definitely has has energy for me, for sure. And I have three more things. This is basil. I picked it downstairs about a half hour ago, so it's a little bit wilty. And I don't know, I just think that, that basil as I mean, I've written about basil, I've written about growing up in an Italian American household and sort of the presence that basil had, in the kitchen, in my mother's recipes. I cook with it now. Basil, you know, does definitely, it definitely, jars my memories. I mean, it's also something clearly that, is part of my present as well. So it's kind of this thing that just is very much alive and breathing in, in my life as a cook, um, as a writer, just as also just a nature lover as well. So that's my basil. And I have two more things. This is not, a smelling one. So this is, part of, well, these are pussy willows. And I just remember growing up, my mother loved pussy willows. She loved pussy willows, and she would always let me, as long as they were open, she would always, let me touch the edge of them. So this is just, I usually try to get them as soon as they come out. And what's nice is you can keep them, and obviously they don't really, I mean, I've never seen them go bad necessarily. I don't even know if that's the right way to put it, but they do last, and they're just a really cool shape. I mean, they're obviously also really pleasing to look at. But for me, it was this idea of, what the touch, how the touch takes me back to like certain scenes. And then finally, I'm just going to say this is something that, was just tossed downstairs, mixed in with actually a bunch of our nail polishes, which is kind of funny that it's there because it shouldn't be, but that's not all that strange. Um, and this is, hand sanitizer, as all of you know, and hopefully you can see it. And I just thought that, this is definitely a smell that's going to, or is relevant in terms of the present for sure. I mean, I was not a person who used hand sanitizer a lot prior to the experience that we're all, sort of, going through right now. But when I smell it now, it makes me realize that it's kind of, to some degree, as it should be, I suppose, everywhere. Um, so interestingly, this smell, depending on what hand sanitizer does, or meaning, like how do I want to put this? Like the progression of where we go in terms of using hand sanitizer as a community of people. This smell may have, for our children, for our young children in particular, this smell may have great meaning when they are writing, let's say 10 or 20 years from now. It may take them back to this time. As I said, depending on what, obviously depending on their experiences and depending on what happens with regard to hand sanitizer in the future. So that's my show and tell. What I'd like you to do now, before we move on, to kind of finish out with a couple of, quotes from writers that have something to say about writing and a little bit about senses, is I'd like for people just to type in, if you want to, your own show and tell, so to speak. So you can't show me, but you can type in an object that, that has, energy for you. An example of an object, or yeah, just an object, or even, I mean, a living thing, I guess, plant or whatever, that, has, a story related to, to the senses for you. All right, so we'll see if anybody wants to, hop on and send something in while we're seeing if that happens, and if it doesn't, that's fine. I am going to just, maybe introduce or reintroduce people who are watching to, a couple of books. Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird is one of my favorite, books about writing. I've actually written, I've used this book in so many of my classes, and I wrote a book review, years ago, on Talking Writing, in fact. That's a great magazine for anybody that wants to read about writing or read about writers' processes. So I had done a kind of a happy birthday book review several years ago for Bird by Bird. But anyway, I wanted to just read a couple of lines from this because I think it really does. I think it really does resonate for what what I'm sort of getting at here. So I'm just going to read a couple of lines, and then we're going to move to the Natalie Goldberg, and then I'm going to check back in on the chat and see. Oh, I see somebody. Okay. Interesting. Mechanical calculator for my grade. So that's okay. So I would imagine that would probably have. I would imagine that the calculator probably has. I guess to use the word I used before, a lot of heat or a lot of fire as a tool for writing in terms of the touch. Also, I think it is. I mean, I am going to. Oh, okay. So yeah, touch and sound. So it's got a plastic case. We have a listener who's talking about the plastic case, and it's stuck, and it sort of makes. It's got a plastic case that is always stuck and is just this heavy metal thing with cranks and sliding metal pieces. So yeah, I mean, obviously touch, possibly sound there as well, and then clearly the fact that it was from a family member, I think just to some degree, and obviously this is going to be different for everybody, but automatically has some emotional content to it. So thank you, William, for that. I'm going to loop back to Anne Lamott to just read a couple of quotes, and then we'll move into Natalie Goldberg, and then we'll just kind of wrap it up and talk a little bit about next week. So one of the things that she says that I think is really just powerful and helpful to me, and obviously, as you see, this is a copy that has been in many places. Writing has so much to give, so much to teach, so many surprises. So I wanted to offer that that as one of the lines from her book, because I wanted to bring or drive home this notion that we can be very much surprised by things in our lives and objects and reactions or just everything around us. We can find surprises and discoveries in not only ordinary things around us now because of how they resonate in relation to our memories, but we can also find discoveries when we think back to scenes, either when we were growing up or even something that happened yesterday. I mean, it varies. This idea that you can rediscover and discover something about yourself or about others from the act of writing or remembering, I should say. The next line that I wanted to read, did I pull the wrong one? Let me see. This was it. She was talking about letters. She was talking about in her classes, which I do a lot too, probably because I learned from her. When students are stuck, a lot of times I'll ask them to write a letter to get themselves started. And in this, she was talking about a class that she taught, and she says here, a woman in a class many years ago wrote a novella-length letter to her daughter about life as a Chinese-American nurse living in Sao Paulo. It included everything she could remember having seen and felt and thought. She read part of it to our class. It was just beautiful, intimate, funny in places, and sad. People cried. Then she used it as a plot treatment for a novel. So I think I focused here on the fact that the letter included everything that she saw, she felt, she thought. She really obviously opened herself up and seemed like she wanted to communicate, from what I could tell from this, the most intimate and even sort of the smallest details. And that was successful for her, and it was successful, it sounds like, for her as the writer of a letter, but also as the writer of the start of a of a of a of a project, a longer, book project. Um, I wanted to also read this one, and it goes like this. Life is like a recycling center where all the concerns and dramas of humankind get recycled back and forth across the universe. But what you have to offer is your own sensibility, maybe your own sense of humor or insider pathos or meaning. All of us can sing the same song, and there will still be 4 billion different renditions. Some people will sing it spontaneously with a lot of soulful riffs, while others are going to practice until they can sing it at the Met. Either way, everything we need in order to tell our stories in a reasonable and exciting way already exists in each of us. Everything you need in your head and everything you need is in your head and memories in all that your senses provide, in all that you've seen and thought and absorbed. So that, of course, resonated with me because of just this idea of, I mean, I think it is empowering and sort of, it's empowering, but it's also liberating to know that you kind of have what you need. It's just a matter of accessing it. I'm going to end tonight with just one quote from Natalie. If I can find it. Sorry, I marked some and I didn't write. Oh, yes. Just one quote from Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones. And then I think next week I'll start with the short chapter, the other chapter that I wanted to share. So again, I just want to finish up by saying I'm going to read this short passage, give a couple of quick announcements, and then I will see you all next week, same time, same place. We can say that pretty confidently these days. And we'll be talking more. And also, I would encourage you to bring, you can certainly bring them, but just be thinking about how objects can sort of be remembered, and how music and playing the songs, smelling things like the Caladrill or like the Play-Doh, how things in your life can become vehicles for remembering, and even, as Anne Lamott says, recycling an experience or a memory. And I know that sometimes people say, oh, I don't want to recycle that memory, and I get that. So this is not about doing anything you don't want to do, but how we can recognize that we can bring something back to life in a new way, because we're writing from a fresh place. Natalie Goldberg says in her chapter, Living Twice, I'm just going to read the first couple of lines. Writers live twice. They go along with their regular life, are as fast as anyone in the grocery store, crossing the street, getting dressed for work in the morning. But there's another part of them there's another part of them that they have been training, the one that lives everything a second time, that sits down and sees their life again and goes over it, looks at the texture and the details. So that's Natalie Goldberg, Writing Down the Bones. Couple of quick announcements, and then I am going to glance at the chat and see if there's anything that people would like me to get back to them on. But I do just want to end with, I think I remembered everything on my list today. I do just want to end with just a note of gratitude. And that is that for anyone who is listening now, or maybe will listen again, or not again, if you're listening now, or if you're listening after the fact, when this community live stream video is up on the shelf with all the other videos that my colleagues and friends at Sarah Lawrence have created. I do just want to give a shout out to anyone in your families, or maybe you yourself, if you're a healthcare worker, on the front lines, in whatever way that means. I would like to just say thank you, and to say that I've been trying to find new words to use to describe what we're experiencing, because saying the same thing over and over gets on my nerves. So I guess it's the writer in me. So I've been using the word bewildering. This week I said to a couple of people, we're really in kind of a trippy time. So whatever you think we're in right now, you can put your own word into that. But I just want to say, in this time that we're in, and again, insert your adjective. One thing that's important for me, and I can only speak for myself, is to remember to say thank you and to be grateful. And so I do want to kind of shout out to anybody that you, either yourselves or to anybody that you know in your family, who is on the front lines or who are on the front lines working, taking care of our neighbors. Uh, and so that's just a big thank you. Thank you from me for that. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about letter writing. Next week, we're going to read a little bit more from Natalie Goldberg. If anybody would like to write a little bit, that would be great. And we can figure out a way for you to share a little bit on the chat, perhaps. And I'm just going to read this and then we're going to sign off. So I love my. Oh, yeah. Okay. So actually, it's interesting. I'm just going to, so the, I'm sorry. Whoops. Sorry about your sweet cat. We talk a lot of, whoops. We talk a lot about loss and the senses and in the writing classroom. I'm going to leave it at that. But what I'll do next week is actually make a note to myself to start a little bit with that. Because we also talk a lot about food and loss. And I know that this particular viewer was talking about the loss of a pet, but certainly I think the idea of using the word fluffy is a obviously is comes from a sense. And I think that that I will just tell you, and I'm sure this is no surprise, that the theme of loss comes up a lot in an essay writing workshop and certainly in a memoir workshop. So we can I'll make a note to myself to start on that next week. But for now, have a wonderful night. I hope everybody's taking care of themselves and the ones that they love. And I look forward to seeing you next week, and stay healthy and well. Take good care.